everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Picture yourself miles from civilization, wandering through unmarked forest paths. It's a place you've chosen, far from the world's noise. The moonlight barely breaks the canopy, and an eerie silence presses around you. And it is eerie, because in these depths, every rustle, every creak of a branch could belong to something far more unnerving than the wild creatures you expect. Whispers of cryptids, nameless, mysterious beings pass through your mind while something moves through the trees. And so what happens when those footsteps aren't the pitter-patter of a curious animal, but something far more threatening? Tonight, we'll step into the world of those who found themselves in the wild, facing unimaginable depths of the unknown. We'll follow their every step, treading between awe, fear, and unanswered questions. So, let's get started, shall we? Camping by myself in British Columbia during the fall. It's not a totally remote area, but it is a few hours from the city and surrounded by woods. It doesn't get a lot of campers that time of year either. My site is a free spot along the river that has a fire pit and a beat-up table. I do a ton of camping in remote areas, so this spot is not a big deal. But that night, I had a very uneasy feeling. I was creeped out the whole night for no reason. I decided to go to bed early. I listened to a podcast on a speaker in my tent while I fell asleep because I was genuinely creeped out. The next morning, while I was making coffee, I noticed that there was someone's hat on the wood table. I know it wasn't there the previous day because I had set my cooking stove on it. So someone came into my camp during the night and left it there. I think the uneasy feeling I had at night was because I was being watched. It may have been a mushroom picker, but who knows? It could have been a baby bear, but I'm convinced it wasn't. During a camping trip to northern Ontario in 2012, I believe I saw a baby Bigfoot. I was 16 at the time, tagging along with my friend and his family for a trip to Algonquin Park. It was my first real adventure into the Canadian wilderness, and I was excited to soak everything in. The towering trees, the different air, the feeling of being completely surrounded by nature. It was different for me. During one of our hikes, we were walking a winding trail through the dense forest when something unusual caught my eye. A flash of black against the vibrant red of a maple tree stood out among the greens and browns around us. I stopped, squinting, and I realized it was a small creature perched on one of the higher branches. It was facing the trunk of the tree, crouched low as if trying to hide. At first, my logical brain thought that it might be a baby bear, but as I studied it, I began to notice things that didn't add up. For one, its limbs looked too long and lean for a baby bear cub. More like arms with small, dexterous hands gripping the bark. Its head seemed rounder, with no visible muzzle or snout like you'd expect on a bear, and when it turned its head slightly, I could see intelligent, curious eyes staring back at me. Eyes that seemed more human than animal. We locked eyes for what felt like several seconds, and that's when it did something strange. The creature pressed itself closer to the tree, hugging the trunk tightly, as if it thought that by hiding its face, I wouldn't be able to see it anymore. It was almost childlike, as if it didn't fully understand how hiding worked. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for it. It looked scared, but not aggressive. "Hey, look," I called out to the group, pointing up at the tree. Everyone stopped, following my gaze. "What is that?" "Oh, it's just a baby bear," someone said dismissively. "We better keep moving before the mama bear shows up." But even as the others began walking again, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature. The more I looked, the less it resembled a bear. The way it clung to the tree, its slender fingers curling around the bark. It was deliberate, so human. And the way it pressed its face into the trunk, as if trying to disappear, was something I couldn't imagine a bear doing. I tried to explain what I was seeing, but no one seemed interested. "It's just a bear cub," they repeated, waving me off. But deep down, I knew they were wrong. I knew what I saw wasn't a bear. It couldn't have been. Bears don't have hands like that. Bears don't behave like that. I thought about that moment often over the years, replaying it in my mind. What was it? A young Bigfoot? Some other creature we don't understand? I'll never know for sure, but I wish I could go back and take a closer look. Maybe snap a picture or find some proof. People still doubt me when I tell the story, but I stand by what I saw. It wasn't a baby bear. It was something else. Something extraordinary. The whole panic in the woods phenomenon is pretty scary in itself. I don't work in forests, but there's some land that's been in my family for generations. It's in the middle of nowhere, super rocky, pretty much just solid woods. Not useful for stuff like building a house out there or starting a farm or anything. One family member lives in a trailer out there, but we mostly just use it for hunting purposes. But since it's been in my family forever, everyone is super familiar with it and is pretty comfortable out there. My dad hunts out there all the time, without anything creepy happening. But one time, he said he was in his tree stand out there, and suddenly, he felt like something was watching him. He didn't know what it was, but he didn't like it. He didn't even bother to gather his things before he fled the deer stand, because he was so freaked out. He just grabbed his rifle and ran back to his truck. He moved his deer stand and no longer hunts in that portion of the woods. It was just so weird because those woods are like a second home to my dad, and he's never scared out there. I grew up in rural Appalachia, so I grew up hearing all kinds of superstitions and legends about ghosts and other creepy things. Of course, as an adult, I realized that they were mostly made up by people trying to scare their kids from wandering off into the woods and passed down over the generations. I was told to never respond if something called my name in the woods, and if we heard whistling outside at night, it meant the devil was close. Of course, there's real truth and valuable advice in some of those stories. If a stranger is calling to you from the woods or whistling outside your house at night, you probably should be afraid, especially as a child. I never experienced either there in the mountains. The scariest thing that ever happened to me wasn't supernatural and happened in New Mexico. My mom died when I was very little, and when I was about 20, my dad passed away, leaving me without immediate family except my brother. Dad didn't have much, but he left his house to my brother, and just enough money for me that I was able to buy 2 acres and a nice used camper. My boyfriend, now my husband, wanted to move back home and be close to his mom, and we planned to eventually build a house. It seemed like such a cool adventure to me at the time. It was literally in the desert. A dirt lot off a dirt road with no electricity or water access and surrounded by other identical empty plots. Until very recently, you could still find land like that for a little bit of nothing because it's inconvenient and expensive to truly live comfortably out there. We had to haul water from my in-laws' house, use a generator for electricity. My husband worked nights as a security guard, so I was alone in that camper almost every night. Honestly, it was boring, and it felt safe enough to me then because I had a big bear of a Rottweiler named Zeus who would have defended either of us to the death. Obviously, though, as I'd find out, it wasn't really that safe, dog or not. It was a normal night like any other. I'd been outside watching the sky while I smoked a bowl and came back in to get ready for bed. I had just undressed and climbed into bed when I heard whistling and felt the camper sort of shift, like a hard gust of wind hit it. It wasn't that unusual, because sometimes the wind blew really hard out there, so I would have ignored it if Zeus hadn't started growling like the devil himself was outside. He was crouched down toward the doorway, ready to attack. I was terrified, and it suddenly seemed so foolish to have assumed I was safe out there alone, with a tin aluminum door between me and whatever was out there in the dark. I couldn't help but think about the story my granddad told me all those years ago, about hearing whistling at night, and while I'm not very religious in general, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't pretty unnerved in that moment. The sound of it was so unnaturally high-pitched that it almost sounded like the wind, but not quite, because it had that sort of sad melody to it. Besides that, my dog had never growled at the wind before. I remember thinking how crazy it was that I could hear it over the generator, and I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It sounded like it was everywhere. I tried to work up the courage to peek outside, but I was frozen to the bed. Zeus was going crazy now, growling and snarling and pacing. He rarely barked, but when he did, it was intimidating as hell. And once he started barking at the wall like he was possessed, everything sort of stopped. It was like the tension in the air just slowly dissipated. Zeus was just as freaked out as me and couldn't settle down until I finally let him outside about an hour later. He sniffed the back of the camper where the bedroom was for a good minute before reluctantly turning away and coming back inside, but I was too chicken shit to go outside myself. Cell service was spotty. This was a long time ago, where everyone still had flip phones, and I was without a way to leave or call for help. When I told my husband the next morning, he was convinced it was traffickers or worse trying to break in on me, and that Zeus had scared them off. It was somewhat plausible to me, but I didn't feel that that was the explanation. No one had actually tried to break in. That would be some strange kidnappers to just stand outside whistling. Then he told me that he'd heard rumors of a small cult who lived nearby out there, and maybe it was one of them trying to scare us away. That was more terrifying to me in a way, since I figured if that was the case, they might come back. But in the daylight with my husband there, it also all seemed a bit silly. I remembered how Zeus was sniffing the back of the camper, and we decided to go look around. The dirt out there is soft and sandy. It looked like it had been trampled around by multiple people with different-sized bare feet. The dirt that was right under the small window over my bed. The weirdest part is how there were no tracks leading off in any other direction, away from the camper. Just the ones outside the window, and one set halfway around the backside wall, right around where Zeus had started barking. Suddenly, that crazy cult rumor didn't seem very far-fetched or silly to me, and that's how I ended up living with my mother-in-law for over a year, because living in fear of being harassed or worse. We still own the lot where that happened, but we bought a place in town. The desert is beautiful, and I love hiking in it with other people. But at the same time, I've noticed something about the desert also really seems to attract crazy folks. One night I was driving home at around 2 a.m., and this tiny, tiny white creature, probably as tall as a Pringles can, though maybe a bit smaller, walked across the road in front of my car. I couldn't believe what I saw, so I called my then boyfriend and frantically described the creature. He told me that sounded like a Fresno nightcrawler. When I got home and looked it up, that's exactly what it looked like. I'd never even heard about them before. I don't live in California, not even close. I still have no clue what it was. Some more details about what I saw, because I hadn't thought about this for a while, but now it's coming back to me. The bottoms of its legs ended in what looked like flowing bits or ribbons, and it was almost translucent. I could almost see the road through the creature. It walked at a kind of jaunty pace, like a person might walk. The best way to describe it is like a super steppy walk that the dwarves would sometimes do in Snow White, or Mickey Mouse does sometimes. I slowed my car down, but was afraid to stop it completely, and the thing disappeared as my car went through it. Honestly, it was so fucking cute I wasn't even scared. But I was a little shaken up having seen something like this. I once worked as a housing inspector. A new client had purchased a house, and I was tasked with going and inspecting it. From the information on hand, the house was very old, built in 1908, was quite derelict, and in the middle of the woods. I was in no hurry to inspect the house, so I scheduled it for my last stop of the day. I did my jobs as per usual, and then I made my way to the house. I parked my car on the road, and as I walked up the long path, nothing jumped out at me. It was a rundown 3-story house. For me, it was just your run-of-the-mill wreck. I guess the buyers had walked through and seen some potential in the home, but I could see none. It was getting to be dusk, and as I didn't have the key to the front door, I made my way to the rear of the property to access the back door. As I came around the back of the house, I noticed that the back door itself opened up into a large kitchen. The sun began to set behind me, and I could feel a drastic change in air temperature. It was late summer, and I assumed that this was the reason for the drop in temperature. I turned to look at the sunset, noting that the cloud cover gave the sky a nice crimson hue. I turned back towards the door, and that's when I saw it. On the other side of the kitchen was a door that led into a hallway, which in turn led to the front door. The front door had colored glass, but what was standing in the darkness of the hallway, to this day, still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was a silhouette of a man. Judging from the build, I could tell it was a man. There were no distinguishable features to see, just a black silhouette. What happened next froze me to the spot. Where his face was, 2 eyes opened, and they were the color red. Unblinking and unmoving. Those eyes glowed red, and I could tell that they were looking right at me. At first I couldn't look away. Those red orbs seemed to stare straight into my soul, and I found myself transfixed, staring back. Every fiber in me told me that I should run, but I could not move. I stared unblinking at the red eyes, and they in turn stared unblinking back at me. My eyes began to water, and I blinked to clear them, but as I opened my eyes again, the silhouette was gone. I freaked. I quickly ran around the house, jumped in my car, and sped home. What would normally take me 25 minutes to drive home only took me 10, as I couldn't get away fast enough. In my report, I wrote that the house and some structural issues couldn't be remedied, and the house was eventually torn down. In its place is a new housing unit with 6 3-bedroom homes. I've heard stories from tradesmen who have been on site at night, and they've all said that they felt a cold chill every time they went there. I did look up the history of the property, but nothing unusual jumped out at me. Up to that point in my life, I never believed in the supernatural or paranormal. Even now, I'm skeptical of most things, but I know what I saw was pure evil, and I've never had an encounter like it since. I worked in national parks and also did some volunteer search and rescue. I guess I can talk about 2 of the worst things I saw in forestry. The latter one is scary, but also deeply tragic. More spooky, I was on a multi-day off-road camping trip by myself in the wilderness, so technically I was not working. I found myself enjoying a night in the woods, slightly tipsy on wine. I settled in for the night in my SUV and awoke to yelling far in the distance. It wasn't screaming, but nor was it singing, something closer to chanting. Went to sleep nervous and with my army knife close. Woke up to someone knocking on my vehicle's glass. It was clearly human because they did the triple knock that all people do. As I came out of my covers to observe, I saw a person looking in the dark. I screamed something guttural, and they ran. I couldn't believe it. I was hours and hours from the nearest town, and if someone drove in over the night, I would have heard the vehicle and all the stillness. I was dumbfounded. I turned on my truck and stayed vigilant for a while. Nothing happened. Next morning, I went and found a new spot to park and set up camp. The second story is sadly something that is very explainable, but very sad to see. One blizzardly night, we hear that they are on a search for a woman who had disappeared from a group that was staying in a cluster of scenic cabins nearby. Not in the park, but very close to the border of it. But certainly a remote place. It took us about 2 hours to get to the cabins and talk to the people there. It was well under negative 17 degrees Celsius, around 0 in Fahrenheit, and with feet of snow. Turns out the people staying in the cabin were on psychedelics, and at some point, the young woman got spoiled while under the influence of drugs and had run off outside, in regular clothes and sneakers. Me and my partner in the search unit picked a search pattern and started looking for footprints. We found some, but they broke off and we lost the trail. After exactly 3 hours and 41 minutes, we found her clothes. And soon after, we found her. She was naked in her entirety, including her shoes. She was barefoot. We found her sitting against a tree and we rushed over. It was clear at this point she was dead. And this time, local police were already on the scene, and after taking our statements, they left. It was a tough few nights after. Nightmares, too. Mothman. That's the only name I've ever been able to give it. It was a warm summer evening and my family had gathered for an outdoor movie night at one of our relatives' houses. They'd set up a big screen in the backyard, rows of folding chairs and blankets covering the grass. The scent of popcorn and citronella candles was mixed in the air. In the sun, it was setting. For a kid around 7 or 8 years old, it really felt like the perfect night. The movie had just started when my attention began to wander. I wasn't interested in whatever was playing on the screen. I still don't remember what it was. so I turned my gaze toward the tree line at the edge of the yard. It was almost fully dark by then, the faint glow of the moon casting shadows across the ground. And that's when I saw something. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, just my imagination playing with the shapes of the trees, but as I stared, I realized it was something else entirely. A tall, black figure stood just beyond the trees, partially hidden by the shadows. It looked like it was covered in fur or hair, its long, spindly arms hanging unnaturally low. Its eyes, though, I remember those most clearly. They glowed a deep, almost fiery red, cutting through the darkness like embers, and it was staring right at me. I froze, not in fear exactly, but in shock. It wasn't moving, not even a little, just standing there, watching. The distance between us made it hard to make out specific details, and the dim light didn't help. I couldn't see if it had wings or not, though part of me expected it to. It was hard to explain the feeling, but it didn't seem threatening. There was an almost unnatural calm about it, like it wasn't interested in hurting me. It just was. After what felt like forever, curiosity got the better of me. I turned and ran back to the group, tugging on the sleeve of the nearest adult. "There's something in the woods," I said, urging them to come and see. Of course, they were skeptical, but I wouldn't let it go. I begged someone to follow me back to where I'd seen it. By the time I returned to the spot, it was completely dark. The figure was gone. The only thing staring back at me now were the trees. I scanned the area desperately, trying to catch another glimpse, but it was as if it had vanished into thin air. Understandably, no one believed me. I was just a kid with an overactive imagination, they said. Maybe I'd seen a shadow or a deer moving through the woods, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a deer. And though I wasn't afraid when I saw it, the memory of those glowing red eyes has stuck with me ever since. What was it? Was it watching me for a reason? Why didn't it move while I was looking? And why did it disappear the moment I turned away? I've never been able to answer those questions, but one thing I do know for sure, it wasn't my imagination. I hadn't thought of this memory for so long until reading comments. It was like something buried deep in my mind was suddenly brought to the surface. When I was a kid, my family lived out in the middle of nowhere in rural Montana. We had acres upon acres of land, surrounded by dense woods and fields that seemed to stretch on forever. My brothers and I spent most of our days exploring, making up games, and testing the limits of our curiosity. One particular summer day stands out. We were wandering further than usual, our feet crunching over twigs and leaves, when we stumbled across something we had never seen before. Tucked into the trees, partially hidden by overgrown brush, was a cabin, or what was left of one. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The roof sagged in places. The wooden walls were grayed and splintered, and one corner had completely collapsed on itself. But what drew us closer wasn't the eerie isolation of the cabin. It was the way it seemed wrong, like it didn't belong there. We didn't hesitate, though. We were kids after all, and caution wasn't exactly in our vocabulary. We approached the rotting porch, the boards groaning under our weight as we crept inside. The first thing that hit us was the smell, damp, moldy, with a strange chemical undertone that made my stomach turn. The inside was just as dilapidated as the outside, but there was one detail that stood out, one that I'll never forget. orange prescription pill bottles. They were everywhere. At first, it didn't seem so strange. Maybe someone had left a few behind. But as we moved deeper into the cabin, it became overwhelming. Open a cupboard and pill bottles would come spilling out. Peer under the sink, there were more. They littered the countertops, filled the drawers, and even sat in piles beneath makeshift furniture. The bottles were in every corner, every crevice, some hidden, some in plain sight, but all of them empty. Hundreds of them. I remember my brothers and I exchanging uneasy glances. We were kids, but even we could tell this wasn't normal. What kind of person needed that many pills, or had been bringing them here, one by one, for some reason that we just couldn't understand? The bottles didn't have labels that we could make out, just worn, faded text. It looked like they'd been deliberately scratched off. We didn't stay long. The air got heavier the longer we were in there. The cabin itself was pressing on us, urging us to leave, basically. I can't explain it, but I remember feeling like we weren't supposed to be there, like we'd stumbled into something that wasn't meant to be found. To this day, I can't shake the image of those bottles, hundreds of them, empty, scattered throughout that forgotten place. Who left them there, and why? I'll never know, but even now, the thought of it sends a chill down my spine. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me. Whether it's your first time or you're a regular, your support means the world over here. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night, and keep those eyes open long enough for those deep sleep videos. And of course, subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. Special thanks to the Darkest Hour channel members: Lori TESDAHL, Sarah Marie, Robert Bailey, T COLTDADDY Eagle, Mallory Dominguez, KARI Watkins, and PILAR Gio. Big thanks to those who shared their stories, and a huge shout out to all of our patrons, whom we appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Mary H, Tanya F, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Tony P, Lissane, Arlene F, Adrienne, TF Parham, and Jason G. If you want to support the Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining our Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour or become a channel member. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, Amanda, darkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.